The 16th plenary meeting of the 11th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly is called to order. The General Assembly will now continue its consideration of Agenda Item 5, entitled Letter dated 28 February 2014 from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, S/2014/136. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I give the floor to Egypt.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
I thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Egypt reiterates its respect for the goals and purposes of the United Nations in accordance with the Charter and the Declaration on the Principles of International Law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states, foremost among which is the principle of prohibiting the use or threat of use of force, the peaceful settlement of disputes, the equality of peoples and their rights and the right to self-determination. This commitment has clearly been illustrated on Egypt's votes on various UN resolutions. Mr. President, Egypt abstained on the draft resolution under discussion for the following reasons. First of all, in its current version, the resolution's proposal is a dangerous precedent. In fact, it asks that the General Assembly develop a mechanism, a register of damage that would be outside of the United Nations institutional framework without clarifying the rules that would govern such a mechanism or its working methods or even the measures that would follow its establishment. The role of the UN or the GA is also not specified when it comes to follow-up, something that is absolutely unprecedented and is inconsistent with the role of the General Assembly. Second, Egypt supports efforts to achieve accountability at the international level for internationally wrongful acts. Yet, like other states, we have witnessed significant challenges around the discussions of the ILC draft articles adopted in 2001 on the responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts within the Sixth Committee. A group of states thus believes that the draft articles do not express international customary law and category refuse to make any progress to ultimately arrive at an international convention. We therefore see that there are divergent views on this practice, and we express our reservations when it comes to the consideration of this topic by the plenary before a consensus is achieved within the Sixth Committee. At a time when international polarization is increasing and reaching unprecedented levels, and when the international UN multilateral system is being accused of double standards, not to mention failures to maintain international peace and security, the motives for the General Assembly meddling in this issue will always be doubtful. It would be preferable, or it would have been preferable, for the General Assembly to remain at a distance from this matter. We are concerned that certain states seem to have great motivation when it comes to setting up such a mechanism for a specific conflict and a mechanism that is outside of the United Nations, when the same group of countries abstains or votes against other resolutions that only seek to implement international law and preserve legitimacy in the case of other conflicts. There is therefore a double standard when it comes to these approaches. Next, if the General Assembly addresses this issue in the context of one particular conflict and excluding other conflict, this will raise legitimate questions as to the cohesiveness of its practice and the ability and willingness of the GA to create similar reparation mechanisms in the future for a great number of countries demanding compensations for internationally wrongful acts and damages that they've suffered from such act, whether in the distant past, recent past, or currently. We believe that the GA's inability or hesitation to take a coherent approach going forward when it comes to several such efforts would harm the credibility of the General Assembly and the United Nations, which is something that we would all want to preserve. Finally, we have always believed and continue to believe, Mr. President, that the current priority is promoting the peaceful settlement of the dispute and the conflict currently underway in Ukraine and to launch serious and comprehensive negotiations in this context. All efforts need to be directed to this end because the prolongation of this conflict without a horizon for a solution would have an enormous impact on the countries of the world that they would be unable to address, especially developing and least developed countries that are attempting to recover and achieve economic stability after an unprecedented global pandemic. The President of the Republic, President El-Sisi, has called at the opening of COP27 for the need to find a solution and put an end to the conflict currently underway in Ukraine. Mr. President, we would have wished to see the General Assembly abstain from interfering in this area and presenting a recommendation on a mechanism that is not based on any specific precedents. Efforts must be made to prevent the intensification of the conflict and avoid further damage caused by the continuation of this conflict. Thank you.
I thank Egypt, and I give the floor to Brazil.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, Brazil decided to abstain in relation to draft resolution A/ES11/L6. In the last months, we have been reiterating the need to redouble international efforts to de-escalate the conflict in Ukraine and to actively look for ways to bring about peace negotiations. Unfortunately, the resolution adopted today does not foster constructive dialogue nor recognize the central role of the United Nations in this process. There is no doubt that under international law, every wrongful act of a state entails the international responsibility of that state as well as the obligation to repair the injuries caused. Although the text adopted today seems to be guided by this general principle of law, it brings a high level of uncertainty regarding the legal parameters of such a register to be created outside the framework of the United Nations and without its supervision. By recommending the creation of such a mechanism, without even specifying its scope, the General Assembly encourages the fragmentation of our collective responsibility in promoting peace. It undermines the United Nations and ignores the efforts already taken, for instance, by the Human Rights Council and the International Criminal Court. Brazil regrets that, once again, the proponents offered insufficient time for discussion, especially considering the long-term consequences of this decision. In light of the unfortunate deadlock in the Security Council on this matter, we expected that this emergency special session should be capable of acting in a more transparent and democratic fashion. Mr. President, we continue to believe in a negotiated solution to the conflict and in the fundamental role the United Nations has in bringing the parties together, including to timely discuss matters related to reparations. This can take time, for sure. Nevertheless, we call on member states to refrain from simply outsourcing our shared responsibilities and thus favoring fragile and hasty answers to complex and delicate situations. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Brazil, and I give the floor to Chile.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you very much, President. Chile once again regrets the victims of the war that is taking place in Ukraine, which has violated the norms of international law, of international humanitarian law, and the Charter of the United Nations. Chile is a supporter of multilateralism and maintains that disputes between states should be resolved within the competent bodies in accordance with the rules in place. We advocate for the multilateral system continuing to be an inclusive space in which states can express themselves without distinction. Our vote in favour of the draft resolution, Furtherance of Remedy and Reparation for the Aggression Against Ukraine, and this explanation of vote consider the commitment and consistent conduct of promoting and respecting human rights at all times and in all places, which will not countenance any impunity. In this regard, we would like to refer to 4 points. First, that there is a fundamental issue pending in this organisation, one of a general nature. The draft articles on the responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts adopted by the International Law Commission in 2001. Since that date, no progress has been made in the 6th Committee because some delegations have not expressed their willingness to negotiate a multilateral convention that would create a clear and binding legal framework that could provide legal certainty to render effective the international responsibility of states. At this session of the General Assembly, this inaction has continued. We call on those delegations to modify their position in a manner that is consistent with this vote on the next occasion that this agenda item is discussed. For Chile, this is of great importance because international peace and security are also undermined in other territories, and we consider that in such circumstances, remedy and reparation for international wrongful acts should also be promoted. Second, we recognise that the General Assembly resolutions have a non-binding character, including the recognition of mechanisms that have effect only amongst participating states and are not enforceable against third states. In this regard, we wish to recall that the international community should bear in mind certain general principles regarding the mechanisms for the peaceful settlement of disputes, such as the free choice of means, the impartiality of any third party involved, and the requirement for consent for all parties to a dispute. Thirdly, access to comprehensive, indispensable reparation for survivors of sexual violence and other forms of violence against women in this conflict and post-conflict situation is indispensable. A system of measures must be created to fully incorporate this. This is necessary not only for the process of comprehensive reparation, but that non-participation could imply a violation of their fundamental rights to collective reparation and participation. We hope that a state reparations fund will be established for relatives of victims of femicide and other violent deaths of women. Fourthly and finally, Chile once again reiterates its call to all parties to continue the negotiations and again urges an immediate peaceful solution to the conflict between the Russian Federation and Ukraine through political dialogue, negotiations, mediation, and other peaceful means in accordance with international law. Thank you very much, President.
I thank Chile. I now give the floor to Indonesia.
Mr. President, we have just adopted yet another resolution that is divisive on an issue where unity is urgently needed to resolve the issue at hand. While we regret important inputs to make the resolution more fitting was not incorporated in the final draft, we recognize the efforts of the facilitators to provide room for some consultation. We emphasize the importance of this approach as we work to strengthen the spirit of multilateralism. Mr. President, Indonesia believes the underlying message of the General Assembly resolution should have been that hostilities and war must stop and that sovereignty and territorial integrity must be respected. The Assembly, as the most representative body of the UN, must unite and work towards this end. In this context, we must continue to encourage all parties to the war in Ukraine to stop the war, re-engage in diplomacy, dialogue, and return to the negotiating table. The only winners of this war are miseries, destruction, death, and more death. Mr. President, on the recommendation to establish a registry of damages and the need to establish a reparation mechanism for Ukraine, we wish to highlight that in ensuring a just reparation efforts, it is important that such mechanisms be built upon a foundation of due process and judicious outcome based on prevailing international laws. We are concerned that a lack thereof may prevent the General Assembly to act prudently and decide prematurely, particularly when the terms of operation of this initiative have yet to be decided and will be negotiated outside the framework of this Assembly. Given the explanation by the sponsors that the mechanism will be set up outside the UN system, we further question the need for this resolution. A General Assembly resolution at this stage may lead us to a slippery slope. The General Assembly is the main deliberative, policy-making, and representative organ of the UN. We must not let a General Assembly resolution be a mere rubber stamp for actions that the Assembly or the UN do not have responsibility to attempt to implement, monitor, review, or report back to its membership. Considering the prejudicial impact of the adoption of today's resolution and the negative precedents it may generate for the Assembly, my delegation abstains on the resolution. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Indonesia. I give the floor to India.
President, India continues to remain concerned over the situation in Ukraine. The conflict has resulted in the loss of lives and misery for its people, particularly women, children, and elderly, with millions becoming homeless and forced to take shelter in neighboring countries. Reports of attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure are deeply worrying. We have consistently advocated that no solution can be arrived at the cost of human lives. Escalation of hostilities and violence is in no one's interest. We have urged that all efforts be made for an immediate cessation of hostilities and an urgent return to the path of dialogue and diplomacy. International principles and jurisprudence vest responsibility on parties to the conflict to ensure that civilians and civilian infrastructure are not targeted in situations of armed conflict. The global order that we all subscribe to is based on international law, the UN Charter, and respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of all states. These principles must be upheld without exception. Dialogue is the only answer to settling differences and disputes, however daunting that may appear at this moment. The path to peace requires us to keep all channels of diplomacy open. It is also unfortunate that as the trajectory of the Ukrainian conflict unfolds, the entire global South has suffered a substantial collateral damage. It is thus critical that the voice of the global South be heard and their legitimate concerns be duly addressed. India's approach to the Ukraine conflict will continue to be people-centric. We are providing both humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and economic support to some of our neighbors in the global South under economic distress, even as they stare at the escalating costs of food, of fuel, and of fertilizers, which has been a consequential fallout of the ongoing conflict. Mr. President, we need to objectively consider whether a reparation process through a vote in the General Assembly would contribute to efforts at a resolution of the conflict. Moreover, the legal validity of such a process by a General Assembly resolution remains unclear. We must, therefore, not create mechanisms or set precedents without adequate international legal vetting that have implications for the future functioning of the United Nations and the international economic system. We need to avoid steps which preclude or endanger the possibility of dialogue and negotiations and from bringing this protracted conflict to an end. Mr. President, my Prime Minister has said unequivocally that this is not an era of war. With this firm resolve to strive for a peaceful solution through dialogue and diplomacy, India has decided to abstain on the resolution. Thank you.
I thank India. Now I give the floor to Singapore.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Singapore voted in favor of the resolution in document L6 entitled Furtherance of Remedy and Reparation against Ukraine. Singapore's decision to support this resolution is in line with our consistent and principled position against Russia's invasion of Ukraine and against violations of the UN Charter and international law. Singapore's vote in favor of this resolution is also consistent with our long-standing support for the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Mr. President, a world where might is right and where aggression has no consequences is unacceptable, especially for small states like Singapore. This is why we had supported and co-sponsored the earlier resolutions of the Emergency Special Session relating to aggression against Ukraine, humanitarian consequences of the aggression against Ukraine, as well as the resolution relating to territorial integrity of Ukraine and defending the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Mr. President, I'd like to place on record that Singapore has supported this resolution on the understanding that it is without prejudice to and does not seek to undermine or prejudge the outcomes of ongoing judicial and investigative processes related to the war in Ukraine. In our view, opening parallel processes do not necessarily contribute to these deliberations in a constructive manner and may even raise serious procedural questions. Therefore, adopting a stepwise approach to these issues is often more productive, and we would urge the proponents to keep this in mind. We also hold the view that the approach adopted in this resolution is not automatically applicable to other conflicts, and that every situation should be considered on a case-by-case basis, taking into account the principles of the UN Charter and international law. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank Singapore. And now I give the floor to Cuba. No. I give the floor to Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Pakistan has always reaffirmed its unequivocal support for the universal and consistent application of the principles of the United Nations Charter and international law, including non-use of force, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, non-interference in their internal affairs, and pacific settlement of disputes, to preserve and build international peace and security, to ensure equal security for all states, and respect for international humanitarian law. These principles apply to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine as well. Mr. President, the draft resolution contained in document A/ES11/L6 seeks to establish an international mechanism for reparation for damage, loss, or injury arising from the internationally wrongful acts of one state against the other during the ongoing conflict. While my delegation fully supports the establishment of a claims commission under the United Nations auspices as part of a comprehensive peace plan, any such mechanism must be based on sound legal foundations. Many of the co-sponsors of the draft resolution are countries that have consistently opposed any discussion on establishing an international mechanism for seeking reparations for slavery and colonialism. Double standards in application of international law are counterproductive. Universal and consistent adherence to the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter is imperative, not only to ensure the credibility and legitimacy of the United Nations system, but also to strengthen accountability and justice for serious violation of international law. It would be unprecedented to establish a remedy and reparation mechanism that is neither managed by nor accountable to any of the United Nations principal organs, including the United Nations General Assembly, which will establish it. Mr. President, in conclusion, my delegation believes that irrespective of the origin of the conflict, the highest priority at this moment is the immediate cessation of hostilities and resumption of peaceful dialogue through direct negotiations, mediation, or other peaceful means to resolve the causes of the conflict and restore peace and security in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank Pakistan, and I give the floor to Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. Kenya has spoken strongly against the war on Ukraine, and particularly the fundamental breach of the UN Charter that it represents. We have lamented the deliberate and accidental damage to civilian objects, and we have regretted the terrible impact of the war on millions of civilians who have fled their homes and suffered almost irreparable harm to their livelihoods. We had serious reservations on aspects of the resolution which were reflected in the outcome of the vote in the high number of abstentions and no votes. Despite this, we voted yes because it is the right thing to do. Ukraine has a sovereign right to make claims for damages and losses incurred by virtue of conflict. This is the right of Ukraine, but also for all peoples and countries that are seeking reparations for colonial violence and dispossession, slavery, and other acts of aggression by powerful states, including members of the Security Council. Following the adoption of this resolution, Mr. President, we underscore the following 2 points that should guide future and ongoing reparation resolutions. First, the international legal framework within which the resolution is premised, specifically the draft articles on responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts, has remained the subject of debate between member states of the United Nations for the past 20 years. to cite the articles as the basis of this resolution should be applied in future as well to resolutions on reparations in the context of colonialism and slavery in particular. Second, this resolution will pave the way for more concrete discussions, decisions, and resolutions on reparations. All member states, including the sponsors and supporters of this resolution, should be ready to heed other peoples, countries, regions' call for accountability for historical injustices, including reparations for slavery and colonialism, through concrete and restorative measures, including the establishment of an inclusive international register of damages. Mr. President, all lives are equal. All outrages against fundamental human rights and principles of freedom, independence, and sovereignty apply to all peoples. This august assembly should have the courage of this conviction of multilateralism as expressed in the United Nations Charter for it to have any chance of surviving, much less thriving. Kenya reaffirms once more its recognition of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank Kenya. I give the floor to Brunei Darussalam.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Brunei Darussalam condemns any violation of sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of any country and reaffirms the importance of upholding the principles of a rules-based framework and respect for international law. On the establishment of a mechanism as a register of damages and for international compensation, Brunei Darussalam notes that similar mechanisms has been established under the ambit of the United Nations or following consultation. In this regard, any such independent mechanism should be similarly established in accordance with due process, procedure, and consultation. We continue to reiterate the importance of diplomacy and to call on all parties directly involved to de-escalate tensions and to settle all differences by peaceful means without resorting to the threat or use of force in accordance with the UN Charter and international law in the interest of maintaining international peace and stability. I thank you.
I thank Brunei Darussalam, and I give the floor to Argentina.
Thank you very much, President. The position of Argentina has been clear and consistent since the beginning of this war. Argentina defends the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity as fundamental principles of the peaceful coexistence of states. Without a doubt, any damage caused as a consequence of this armed conflict must be subject to reparations in accordance with international law. Argentina has supported the draft resolution on the furtherance of remedy and reparation for aggression against Ukraine with a view to achieving accountability for acts that violate the Charter of the United Nations without prejudice. We believe that it is important to indicate that in order for such reparations to be made for wrongful acts, in addition to speaking about this, it is also necessary to talk about choosing appropriate means for this. Finally, we should also bear in mind that accountability in the face of internationally wrongful acts should be applied to all parties and acts that need reparations without prejudice or pre-affirmed decisions. For this reason, Argentina has voted in favor of this draft resolution. Thank you.
I thank Argentina, and I give the floor to Qatar.
Mr. President, I deliver this statement in explanation of the vote on the resolution titled Furtherance of Remedy and Reparation for Aggression against Ukraine. Mr. President, Qatar expresses great concern over the ongoing Ukrainian crisis since last February without any clear and genuine prospect for a political solution and in terms of its catastrophic impact to civilians as long with time passes and the escalation of military actions. Therefore, we call parties to the war to show restraint and genuine political will to stop this war immediately. We reaffirm our declared and consistent position regarding the Ukrainian crisis since its outbreak in last February, a position that is clearly rooted in the principles of the international law, the UN Charter, and the relevant UN Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. Therefore, we supported the respect of the sovereignty and the independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We also called for full compliance with the principles of the Charter according to Articles 2 that requires member states to settle international conflicts peacefully and refrain from using force or threat to use force in international relations. Qatar voted in favor of Resolution AES 11/L6 in line with its previous positions since the start of the Ukrainian crisis. This vote is also aligned in words and spirit with Qatar's unwavering position regarding the protection of civilians and providing reparations for material and psychological damages as a result of the war. However, the reparations and mechanisms to implement them should be conducted in accordance with the principles of international law and established international precedents in this regard. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Qatar, and I give the floor to the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, the United Arab Emirates associates itself with the statement delivered by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on behalf of the states of the Gulf Cooperation Council. I would like to make some additional comments in my national capacity in light of the vote that has taken place. The UAE abstained because the text of the resolution is unclear and imprecise. It offers the support of the General Assembly for reparations and evidentiary processes that are yet to be defined by a group of member states that is still to be determined. When such mechanisms have been developed previously, their modalities and mandates have been defined at the outset, with the broad agreement of the international community. This has not been the approach with respect to the present resolution, and we are concerned about its potential consequences, including in relation to important international legal principles such as sovereign equality and sovereign immunity. This resolution should not be seen as validating or authorizing unilateral acts, including assets confiscation, taken with the purpose of facilitating remedy or reparations. Putting in motion an uncertain process with unknown implications, even in the name of a just cause, can undermine the predictability and stability on which the international system is based. Mr. President, as we have stressed before, there is an urgent need for a cessation of hostilities and peaceful resolution to the war in Ukraine, and the UAE stands ready to promote any efforts towards this end. At the same time, we underline the need for a broad-based effort to rebuild and reconstruct Ukraine. The UAE has been actively contributing to the humanitarian response, and we stand ready to continue our support. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the United Arab Emirates, and I give the floor to Nigeria.
Mr. President, distinguished delegate, Nigeria continues to deplore the armed conflict and resultant humanitarian situation in Ukraine and welcomes the concern and effort of member states to the restoration of peace and stability in Ukraine. We call on all parties to the conflict to urgently consider utilizing dialogue and negotiation towards a sustainable end to the conflict. Nigeria remains committed to the purposes and principles of the United Nations and opposes any act of aggression or unilateral action by any country or group of countries outside the United Nations system. We call on all countries to refrain from actions that could exacerbate the armed conflict in Ukraine and instead redouble effort towards bringing the parties together towards resolving the conflict. Nigeria believes that current efforts should focus on an immediate end to hostilities so as to prevent further unnecessary loss of life and damage to civilian and other infrastructure. Nigeria is most open to working with all countries towards the above-mentioned aim and therefore hard to abstain. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Nigeria, and I give the floor to Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the delegation of Sierra Leone has requested for the floor to explain its vote on the resolution. The government of Sierra Leone has already expressed grave concern about the regrettable conflict in Ukraine with ramifications for international peace and security, including food security. Since the convening of the 11th Emergency Session under the Uniting for Peace Resolution 377A5, adopted by the General Assembly on 3rd November 1950, Sierra Leone has been consistent in expressing commitment to the Charter of the United Nations and respect for its principles and international law, including the principles of sovereign equality of all UN member states, territorial integrity or political independence of member states, non-interference, and the peaceful settlement of dispute. We accordingly voted in favor of inter alia Resolution ES 11-1 of 2nd March 2022, entitled Aggression Against Ukraine, ES 11-2 of 24th March 2022, entitled Humanitarian Consequences of the Aggression Against Ukraine, and ES 11-4 of 12th October 2022, entitled Territorial Integrity of Ukraine, defending the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. In our votes and explanation of votes, we have also eschewed the selective application of the UN Charter, its principles, and international law. Our votes have been based on principles and established practice of the United Nations and not meant to absolve the actions and inactions of the United Nations. Mr. President, Sierra Leone abstained in the vote on A/ES 11L6, Furtherance of Remedy and Reparation for Aggression Against Ukraine. Like our other votes in the 11th Emergency Special Session, Sierra Leone has been guided by the same belief in the United Nations Charter, its consistent application, and the consistent application of international law. Sierra Leone, as a strong proponent of accountability in the international system, affirms, and I quote, the importance of addressing the question of remedies and reparation for victims of gross violations of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law in a systemic and thorough way at the national and international levels. End of quote. We, however, note that the General Assembly is not an adjudicative body and therefore cannot set out the legal consequences for an international wrongful act without more set out in A/ES 11L6. Accordingly, the General Assembly was called upon to express a political view on the issue without a judicial determination. In this regard, Sierra Leone has abstained in order not to acquiesce to a political approach that does not recognize all victims, past and present, right to benefit from remedies and reparation, and for which the international community must keep faith with the plight of all victims, survivors, and future human generations, and reaffirm international law in the field. The, and I quote, historical racial injustices of slavery and colonialism has remained largely unaccounted for today, but which nevertheless require restitution, compensation, satisfaction, rehabilitation, and guarantees of non-repetition, end of quote. Reparations concern both the past and the present. Reparations for slavery and colonialism entail moral, economic, political, and legal responsibilities. We therefore note with regret the serious political opposition to reparations for colonialism and slavery that remains amongst countries that benefited the most from both. Sierra Leone agrees that under international law, a state said to be the responsible state for an international wrongful act is under an obligation to make full reparation for the injury caused by the international wrongful act. Sierra Leone affirms this principle as part of customary international law and as reflected in the authoritative draft articles on responsibility of states for international wrongful act adopted by the International Law Commission. We conclude, Mr. President, by continuing the call for the immediate cessation of the hostilities and urge for good faith diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict. I thank you.
I thank Sierra Leone, and I give the floor to Bahrain.
Thank you, Mr. President. Bahrain reiterates the importance of abiding by the principles of the UN Charter and international law, particularly the respect of the sovereignty of member states, non-interference, and to settle disputes peacefully. As such, Bahrain would like to renew its support to all efforts towards using diplomatic means to de-escalate the tensions and settle international and regional conflicts. The UN remains, with all its agencies and specialized agencies to that matter, is a main element in supporting dialogue and international cooperation in line with the principles and mechanisms that seek to guarantee friendly relations among countries and preserve international peace and security. And therefore, we reiterate that for any mechanism should work on the basis of the rules of the UN and the multilateral system to settle disputes in line with international law standards and seek safety and security through different means while maintaining the pivotal role of the UN to serve humanity as a whole. Bahrain expresses its hope that work continues towards reaching a peaceful settlement that meet the needs of all parties and avoid further political, economic, and humanitarian repercussions of this crisis. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Bahrain. We have heard the last speaker in explanations of vote after the vote. In accordance with the terms of paragraph 5 of the resolution adopted this morning, the 11th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly is temporarily adjourned. The meeting is adjourned.